Allons-y. Hello. Welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
Bonjour, this is Chad Lott.
This is episode 27. We're going to be covering the French film Raw from 2016. Next episode, get you ready, we will be covering Trick or Treat from 2007. It's kind of one of my little favorites. Excited to share it with people. That'll be our Halloween episode.
Yeah, it's exciting. I haven't seen it yet. It's from a period of time where I didn't really watch very much horror. I haven't seen very much from like 2000 to 2010, but I'm excited to see it. It's kind of like an anthology sort of deal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that shit. I just got this massive collection of Tales from the Crypts that I grew up with.
Oh,
like my mom found it. Well, actually, my dad found them in the attic, and I thought they had all been lost from Hurricane Katrina. So I've been reading these just terrible and awesome, like just bad horror stuff, but like some of it really good. But there's something about the anthology horror format that seems really fun. Like you don't see rom-com anthologies or things like that.
I mean, it's part of its history. It's part of its legacy. I mean, genre film and comic and fiction is so much rooted in this history of being anthologized.
Yeah, it's interesting a little bit how memory plays with anthologies, because when I think about something like Creepshow, which we were just talking about a little bit before we started recording, I have like a lot of the different stories in the original Creepshow pretty mixed up in my mind. You know, like it sort of works like one big story, even though it's not. Although I have seen Creepshow pretty recently, and I was like, oh, right, that's not even in this part of this movie. That was the other part of this movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while we're telling you what to do, please go rate and review this very podcast.
Yeah, if you haven't already, go over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review and leave a word or two about how horrifying your life would be without this great show about horror. It's one of the more fun things for us. And then down the road, as we try to get bigger guests and do bigger events, it gives you a little bit of social proof. Like, hey, look, a lot of people like the show. And
totally.
That's the coolest part.
And, you know, it's funny. I listen to a lot of podcasts, as, you know, maybe a lot of our listeners do. And I feel like the ask to rate and review is this like invisible moment in all podcasts that you just sort of blank out, or you hit you get ready to hit the forward button.
I always do.
Yeah. And then sometimes podcasts will like stop and go, no, really, 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 it makes a big difference, rate or review. And then you might actually notice that they're being all earnest and imploring and say like, well, maybe I'll consider it. And then you don't. So I'm doing the really, really, really. Hey guys, if you haven't taken a moment to rate or review Scary Thoughts on iTunes, please do so. It really actually makes a difference for all this wonderful free content you're receiving.
If you don't, what else? Fuck off.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Another option is go to our website, scarythoughts.org, sign up for our newsletter. And one more note before we dig into Raw is that this is all spoily. We are talking about this film as a movie that you have seen and we have seen, and let's just get to the fucking movie.
All right.
So Raw, where do we want to start with this one?
Well, the first thing people might notice about it is that it is a French movie. And which I, for some reason, even though I knew it was made by a French woman and I had seen interviews with her, for some reason I just didn't expect it to be subtitled. And it's such a reminder, if you don't watch foreign film that often, like how different some of the pacing and choices and the selection of actors can be. And I don't want to say it's necessarily better, but it's definitely more novel.
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood really does have a very specific way of approaching filmmaking, even when it's low budget. There's a certain gloss and veneer and momentum and approach to acting that, soon as you get outside that system, shifts quite dramatically.
Yeah, or even you get like, okay, we're going to have our hook actor. Like, yeah, okay, we're going to have we got Sean Astin attached. And you're like, okay, the guy from Rudy, awesome, cool. You know, and then they're there. And so there's always these artifacts of Hollywood approval, even in these sort of like lower budget movies. You're like, okay, well, you know, it's got that guy in it, so it must be at least somebody thumbs up it in Hollywood. There was a French movie Like, I don't know any of these actors. They could be enormous there. They could be...
Well, the one in particular that the guy who plays the father is Laurent Lucas, and he was actually in two, at least that I know of, he was in two other films that are part of, I think we're going to be talking about New French Extremity as a sort of genre, but without jumping ahead too much, he was in two other examples of that. In My Skin from 2002, which is not that far from Raw in some respects, and he was also in the film Calvaire from 2004, which is sort of like the French version of Deliverance. Have you seen either of those?
No, I haven't.
They're both great.
Yeah, I'll have to see them.
But you have read Alexandra West's book on New French Extremity, right?
Yeah, so I read about half of it and realized I hadn't seen hardly any of the movies, so I kind of parked it until I saw all of them because I felt like as great as the book was, like I got halfway in, I was like, man, this is just like a book that would just be better if I had seen all these movies.
Yeah.
And so my goal was to kind of watch them, just because I wanted to see more of them, and they seem right up my alley. So I'm kind of jazzed on it.
Maybe, so I get the feeling like maybe I've seen more of the canon of New French Extremity, but you've read half the book. Let's take a stab at least quickly sort of encapsulating what that is for our listeners who maybe don't know. Although I kind of feel like anybody who listens to this podcast might actually know what that means, maybe better than we do.
Yeah, I don't doubt that there are people in our audience who could probably write like PhD level theses on French Extremity. But, with my limited exposure to it, it was this moment in French genre cinema that got really dark and really extreme and really graphic. And I mean, who the fuck knows what they were responding to over there? But I mean, it was definitely around the same kind of like 2006 to 2009 time period where the world seemed like it was melting down. And, very known for these sort of like body horror shots where people are getting like pieces of their body removed. It's often very sexual, a lot of sexual violence.
Yeah, a lot of it feels like an extension of what Cronenberg was doing, but not surreal and not fantastic, and an extension of what torture porn was sort of birthing, but actually incredibly existential, rather than wallowing in just the flash and the blood. It was actually a lot of New French Extremities lingering on the suffering of the human body is not about the dazzle of the special effects, but of the pain and what that means as a subject that is being treated as an object.
Yeah. To me, like the torture porn movement, I mean, it's obviously very maligned. People who are like really into sort of cerebral horror like to shit on it. But to me, it's part of this tradition of kinetic filmmaking that goes back to like Buster Keaton. There's like it's almost more in line with the Three Stooges, but it's sort of like graphic. Hold on,
No.
Where I mean, it's about what is done to a body, and it's shocking, and it's so unbelievable and so jarring that oftentimes the deaths kind of elicit humor. You're like, oh shit, her whole fucking face got blown off. Where in French Extremity, you sort of have to kind of wallow in it a little bit. And you're like, oh shit, what would it be like if I had to live with all my fingers eaten off by a pig? Like there's this moment where you don't know if they're going to live or die, and there's more at stake than simply the experience of the pain. There's like how you might have to live with it or endure it later.
Right. And there's also a lot of morality going on. I mean, it's funny. I feel like the Hollywood, or at least the American torture porn, is often apolitical, but New French Extremity's version of a lot of the similar thing is nihilist. It's almost politicized to the degree that it is apolitical, although a lot of it is very directly political. New French Extremity, it's hard to sort of like sum it up because they are incredibly diverse filmmakers with very different ideas, and some of it is overtly feminist, and some of it is totally nihilist, and some of it is really misanthropic. And I think that something interesting, we just covered It for our last episode, and we were talking both on and off mic about this idea of cosmic horror in film and how it's sort of this like underrepresented in my thinking is it's kind of hard to fund cosmic horror because how do you depict it? I mean, that's partly a Lovecraft thing too, is like the horror that can't be named. Well, then how do you make a movie about something that can't be named and can't really be seen without it looking ridiculous? Or you imagine it as something specific, and then you need a lot of CGI or puppets, and then it's suddenly actually not that horrifying.
Yeah.
And I feel like body horror and New French Extremity in particular is sort of the other side of the scale from cosmic horror. It's almost never fantastic, fantastic with the QUE. It's almost always about like being, existence, suffering here and now, as opposed to pure existential angst, right? It's about the angst of being trapped in a body, trapped in a culture.
Yeah. I mean, the French definitely nailed that whole like being upset at shit while wearing a leather jacket thing before anybody else did.
Yeah.
And I think that their earlier adoption of their culture of like more of like a wider spread atheism and nationalism, nihilism, although I guess there is a bit of a rampant nationalism catching up with them right now.
Yep.
But, I think that their broader culture is able to, I don't want to say more equipped to deal with these ideas, but the idea of having anxiety around nihilism is a thing there. Whereas I don't think outside of, some neckbeards in Oakland in the black metal scene, I don't think there's like a whole lot of dwelling on nihilism outside of like really tight academic circles in America.
and most of the books in this room.
All right.
Interestingly, also, I'm just going to take a stab at her last name because I never was able to hear her say it on mic, but Julia Ducournau, I guess. It was interesting watching a lot of interviews with her. Getting ready for this episode was for me similar to getting ready for Get Out, which is like, I'd watch one interview with Jordan Peele and it made me excited to watch another interview. And the more interview, even though it was spelling, Jordan Peele is sort of like spelling out the movie for you.
Yeah.
He's so good at it that it made me want to like sink more into his process and what he has to say about this movie, about Get Out. And this movie was very similar for me. It was her first feature film, and she talked to a lot of people, and she gives great interview.
Yeah,
and it was
she's
super
great.
fun to dig into all of her ideas around this film and filmmaking in general.
But she's a little bit more on the obfuscate the meaning kick than Jordan Peele is.
True.
I think Jordan Peele is like, this scene means this.
Right.
The symbolism of the helmet is this. And for her, like you ask her something specific, and she's like, well, I have a very specific idea of what that means, but I'm not going to tell anyone because I don't want your meaning to be adulterated by my meaning of it.
Although she does do the French thing sometimes of listening to people's interpretation and going like, you're stupid.
She does the puff cheek things, just like she can't, like it's like the French, I can't even with you.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Although in listening to her too and in having watched this film, as much as we have just walked out the whole French Extremity thing, I don't think I would put this movie in that category. I mean, it's French and it's extreme, but I don't think that it has the same. I just don't think it has the same nihilism that like a French Extremity film would.
Some other films, I mean, there is this thing I find in New French Extremity where there is simply, it's not like there are nihilist films and there are feminist films and they're opposed, but nihilism as it's presented in New French Extremity and feminism as it's presented in New French Extremity don't really add up to one genre. The filmmakers who are sort of like on the two sides of that are making pretty different films, and I think she's making film more in line with a lot of the women, honestly, the women filmmakers in France in the last few decades.
So if I saw more French Extremity, maybe I would have a different feeling on it. But this, I sort of always give foreign films a lot, maybe more credit, but I'm like of the opinion this is like a singular film. There's just something different about it that I would put it more. God, I don't even know what I would put it into. I mean, my first thought when I walked away from it, and I was kind of half joking when I was texting you, I thought it was a hilarious movie. I thought there was
you're
a
gonna have
lot.
to explain that one, because like there are some moments that are funny, but I think you thought it was funny.
I mean, I laughed through the whole thing.
Jesus.
I mean, to me, like the scene where she's like eating the finger and stuff like that. There's just so much.
It's pretty funny.
I mean, it's not quite campy, but a lot of the performances are just so odd. And then every single scene, there's something in it that makes it worse than it needed to be. Like there's a scene where she's just throwing up. She has 2 fingers in her mouth. She's throwing up outside, and then a nurse just walks by behind her. And she doesn't interact with that character, but you just know that another person walking by would bum you out if you were in the middle of that. And every single scene has something like that. Like somebody is leaned over a little too far, or, the dog sniffs somebody's crotch, or,
Just a quick thing about the finger. It actually kind of reminded me of our conversation with Fonique about Black Swan in our Black Swan episode.
Garbage cake?
Garbage cake is like floor finger.
Yeah.
Like who hasn't eaten a floor finger?
Why not? Yeah.
Going back to Ducournau and her interviews, I really got the feeling that it'll be really interesting to see what films she makes after this, because she seemed to make the way she talks about Raw is almost as if she was writing an essay. Mm-hmm. And the way in which I mean that is that when she talks about cannibalism, which I'm sure we'll talk about more shortly, she almost defends cannibals. She's always she went so far down the road of conceptualizing what it would be like to crave human flesh that she almost takes on a social justice verbiage when talking about the characters in this film. She has such sympathy for these cannibals and what if they were real. And well, there are, and she's always saying like, well, the cannibals are real. There are cannibals and they're people just like us. And she's always like sort of leveling the playing field, which is sort of a conceptual exercise that she's taken really far down the road, like one would do in an essay, to sort of like feel out the philosophical implications of what that sort of line of thinking leads to, and then made a film based on it. Yeah. But then she's sort of like still in that place. Does that make sense? It sort of reminds me of when Forrest Whitaker played Idi Amin in The Last King of Scotland. I guess he went so deep into that character that he would do interviews to promote the film and go like, sort of like defend Idi Amin, like, and he like developed a fondness and actual sympathy for this awful person. He like just kind of crossed over. Unfortunately, he got so deeply into the subject matter, and I feel like that's partly what this filmmaker has done here, is almost like an actor would do with their own awful, like if someone was playing a serial killer and kind of like went a little past the line. She did with her own material, but I also feel like, and that's what French philosophers do,
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, she has what I might call like an atavistic wonder surrounding cannibalism a little bit, where she references it as like, there's one point where she talks specifically about like who cannibals were, she talks about, it was ritualistic, it was old, blah, blah, blah. And so she talks about, in one interview, about how her film is just full of archaic ideas. And so the idea that this would be a really old type of person to explore, like a cannibal, like there's just not cannibals like there used to be. And then she has another interesting point in an interview where she kind of describes the relationship between the sisters, where she's saying this is an ancient, like pre-biblical type of relationship, like where they are trying to murder each other at all times. Like there is one sibling that's sort of the stronger, and it's the younger's version to like kill, consume, and destroy them eventually. And so I think all that's kind of going on. But cannibalism's an interesting taboo because like biology sort of self-selects against it. It's not just something that, it's weird and it's gross and we don't like it because we're not used to it. Like that's a thing. Where like in biology, like if you eat other people, like in Papua New Guinea, they all get basically the human mad-cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is this neurodegenerative thing. It's like the same thing with like, cultures that are like cousin fucking for generations. You ended up with a bunch of mutants. So it's one of the types of taboos that seems to have a bad physical reaction to it. And,
Right.
yeah. And it's like a lot of these taboos are like that, but there's a little bit of, it seems like she's trying to do a little bit like what Nabokov does in Lolita, where you're trying to get sympathy for this monstrous person. And I think it works. I mean, the character Justine seems sympathetic.
Right. But I think the hard line to walk out between Lolita and this film is I don't really want to open up a conversation about if, oh my God, what's the protagonist in Lolita? Humbert.
Yeah.
If he can help who he is, because I'm, ugh. But,
Right.
you know, this movie is about her discovering who she is, and she is not given the tools by her family to deal with the fact that she is an outsider and that she's actually dangerous to herself and other people. I think that that's a really interesting thing that's happening as a family dynamic in this movie that's rolled out is Alexia, her older sister, you know, won't come and see the parents, won't greet her. And it strikes me that she's probably like furious at her family that she had to learn who she is alone and develop her own survival strategies, which seems to mostly be diving in front of moving cars and eating people who crash without airbags.
Yeah.
And then Justine is sort of not really mentored by Alexia. She's sort of left to her own. And in fact, Alexia makes it worse for her by outing her publicly, even. Although she does forgive her for eating her finger, it's very complicated.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, like a lot of the acting is so subtle in this movie, and it's just so good. And when you watch it the second time through, and or multiple times if you do, like the second time I watched it without the subtitles on. Just I don't know why. I just thought see if like a few years of French in high school would carry me through it.
Yeah.
And the only thing you really miss, I think, you might not pick up on the fact that they're sisters. Like other than that, and you might not. Well, and you basically pick up on everything else pretty much. Like you
Right.
kind of get the film. It's so visual, and the actors do such a good job. But when her sister wakes up after her finger has been cut off, and she wakes up and sees Justine chewing on it, she has like one tear that goes down her cheek, and like in her expression, you can just tell it's like, oh shit, you're this thing too, and that's
Right.
terrible.
Right.
And it's such a good scene, and it comes after really maybe the best scene in the best extended scene in the whole movie, which is the waxing scene.
Right.
Which is just everything about that scene is great and awkward and gross. Like the way it starts off where Justine's just sitting there with her legs up, and you're like, what the fuck's going on here? And then the dog comes in and is like huffing at her crotch, and it's not like there for a long time, but it's weird. It's just lingers just long enough for it to be like, what's this dog going to do? And then the sister comes in and chases the dog away, and then the waxing begins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This movie also, as far as relationships are concerned, sort of reminds me of an early Adam McGoyan movie where a lot of his earliest films were about these codependent/interdependent relationships and how they're built, and really getting into the psychology of watching people, whether they're family or friends or chosen family, create these really elaborate structures that allows everybody to sort of move forward in the world, even if those structures are deeply, deeply fucked up. It's all sort of like a complicated survival skill. And that's sort of the reveal at the end of the movie, right? Is when Dad opens his shirt. It's kind of really funny. I mean, it's not a Shyamalan reveal. It's actually pretty funny. But at the same time, what it reveals is like mom and dad have figured out a way to be together, to be in love, and for mom to continue to be a cannibal, which is preposterous and ridiculous and funny. But at the same time, it sort of says something about like, they figured it out. They figured out a way. Now these daughters have to figure out a way. However, it also shows that they as parents have completely failed to prepare these kids for what is in store for them.
Yeah, the other way of looking at it too, maybe a little more generous, is I mean, I think about it as I get older and like I'm like steadily approaching middle age, is like there's just nothing new. Even if you're fucking cannibalism, people have been through it and they get over it. You know, and they figure out some way to deal with it. Like all the stuff that you really think you're going through that's just so fucking nuts. I mean, even to the point of like, oh my God, I ate my friend.
Right.
Like even that, it's your parents have been there. They've already seen it, whatever. And then I think you're right though to say that like little heads up, you know, like
nice.
yeah, it would have been nice, you know.
Well, it's, you know, the nothing new thing is, I think reflected in the fact that there is a way in which this is a coming of age story. I mean, it's sort of like past high school, but I think she's supposed to be 16. So, you know, she's a virgin and she's, it seems like she's in a certain way, an excellent student at the expense of social skills or something like that. She seems very sheltered. And it being a coming of age story, sort of morphing that into it being a cannibal story sort of gives it this like, yeah, there's nothing new. Like everybody goes through it. Everybody comes of age. Everybody has to confront their body in different ways.
Yeah.
It's just that her version is a cannibal version. And that's the way in which this movie actually reminds me of Ginger Snaps. I feel like all the movies that it's close to, that's one of my favorite movies. Love it so much. But another movie, have you seen Zed and Two Knots? Zed and Two Knots, like Peter Greenaway's, I don't know, fourth movie, feature film. But it's all about how natural rotting and decay is and embracing it. Anyway, I really recommend that one. It's pretty extreme, but it's in no way a horror film. Even though talking about this as genre New French Extremity is not necessarily helpful, although we can talk about, well, what is the context in France that this is coming out of? And the filmmaker doesn't think of this as a horror movie, which is totally valid. But I think there might be something worth talking about cannibalism in films as being a pretty rare thing, actually. Despite the epicness of the horror genre, there isn't actually a lot of there aren't actually a lot of cannibal movies. And most cannibal movies that I can think of aren't really horror movies. Like Parents isn't a horror movie. The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, spoiler alert, is not a horror movie, right? But vampires are kind of cannibals in a certain sense. I mean, werewolves are sort of cannibals. Zombies are sort of cannibals, especially if it's a rage virus situation. So actually, in a certain way, maybe most horror films are cannibal films.
Well, I mean, think about how often someone gets eaten by something that is aware,
humanoid.
Yeah, like I mean, it has agency. Like, so people are often getting their asses eaten in these movies.
I think you phrased that a little incorrectly.
No, people get their asses eaten. It happens. Yeah. Like, doesn't that happen to Dad Bod Drake in this movie? Like his buttocks and leg gets eaten.
I think we have two different versions of what eating ass means.
Yeah, but I mean like in the movie where they crashed the plane and they had to cut chunks of the butt off and eat it. Yeah. That's the only connotation I'm aware of.
Okay, well, it is Folsom Street Fair today.
That is true. That is true. And there's probably some sort of mild cannibalism afoot.
Definitely.
Anyway, yeah, like I think though, like a cannibal that is simply somebody that eats other people with seemingly no benefit other than they just like it or it fills some sort of like void in them or whatever, pretty rare, you know?
Well, what I wonder is why, right? Like, why is that a rare thing? I have a half answer with a question mark is that if we make it a vampire, if we make it a werewolf or a zombie, it's partly fantastic. And that makes it easier for us to make this other person an capital O other. Something is being done to a human by an other. And to transgress that and go like, no, the cannibal is just another person is maybe more horrifying than murder, right? Like, what's worse than murder? Maybe cannibalism by a human being. Yeah. And it might be just a little too much. It's kind of hard to spin that into a fun horror movie, right? Like, because all movies that I can think of that are cannibal based are no fun. They're not fun horror movies.
Yeah, there aren't too many. Although, man, like now that I'm thinking about it, like Silence of the Lamb, like Hannibal Lecter is a cannibal. I mean, there's maybe more than we're just pulling from right now. But I think, though, you're right, is like probably the grisliest crimes are cannibal-related crimes. Like you think about like Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein or any of the classic serial killers that just consume human flesh. It does seem to be a pretty universal bummer, And even when people are starving, you hear these stories of people lost at sea and they eat somebody, like they can just never live with themselves or something like that. You're like, man, you kind of had to. And you're like, oh, but it haunted me or whatever.
Right.
But then you read about, the Vice Guide to Liberia, where like all these child soldiers were like eating the heart of a little boy before they went into battle because they thought it made them invincible. So you have in Liberia thousands of cannibals that are just still running around, like General Butt Naked. Like that dude, I mean, if you haven't seen the Vice Guide to Liberia, it's pretty fucking intense because the main dude that Shane Smith is running around with, he's the founder of Vice, Shane Smith. He's running around with this dude named General Butt Naked, who got his name from stripping down to nothing and going into battle completely naked after eating the child's heart of an enemy, right? And so all of his top soldiers would do that. And after he got off the battlefield and Liberia settled down a little bit, he became like a born again dude. He's like a preacher now. So they're like, yeah, even though you were a cannibal and you're probably responsible for like 30,000 people dying, you wear a white suit and you preach, so it's cool now. But when he was reformed, there was a problem with cannibalism in Liberia for a while because there was no meat. But there were like bodies everywhere. So these like kebab dudes were making like human flesh kebabs, and he caught them because he knew what human flesh tasted like. And he was like,
holy shit.
It's a totally crazy story. So he is like, my friend, this is human flesh. It's against the law. And so he gets the authorities to come and bust this dude in this ring of human flesh barbecue guys. And so that's not that long ago. That's like 15 years ago that happened. So I guess there are still cannibals,
Yeah. So this is just anecdotally, personally, an entryway into this film because I've been a vegetarian since I was 16, and I've been trying to become not vegetarian. Like I've been, just for health reasons, I've been trying to introduce like raw fish into my diet because I figure it'll probably add 10 years to my life or something. And it's been very difficult because I do not view, like instinctually, primally, there is nothing about any meat that seems like food to me. It just seems totally repulsive. And I usually have to drink a beer first to get up the nerve to eat fish until I started training, until I started going to the gym regularly. And now my body just like craves protein. Like it just like this switch got flipped in me where I suddenly primally, it's like the opposite. It's like suddenly, especially fish is becoming food for me. And it's not that I have to convince myself to eat it. Like I want it. It's very weird.
Yeah, it's odd. This movie, as much as vegetarianism is part of the plot, does not really revel in it too much. Even the director, I think in a very French way, bristles at the idea that this is a vegan movie. Like even somebody asked her, they're like, "So is this a vegan movie?" She's like, "This is not a vegan movie." And like, so
man, your accents are amazing.
They're bad. They're the worst. But whatever. It's not what I'm getting paid for here. But yeah, so it's funny. Like she sort of approaches it as like, look, this is just a plot point in this film.
Yeah.
But whereas other people, it was very, very forward because there is an extended conversation that to me is very funny when they're talking about like monkey rape, whether or not it's even a legal thing.
Yeah.
And what Justine does in the scene is what I think a lot of people find really distasteful about kind of the hard edge vegan scene, where she just equates things. She's like, no difference between raping a woman and raping a monkey. And, on one level, you can sort of understand her argument, like sentient creature, violation of will, sentient creature, violation of will. But to even, on one level, even just compare the suffering of a monkey with the suffering of a human, like to people who care a lot about humans, it's pretty distasteful. It has a bit of the ring of like, when people are like, there's a Holocaust going on right now on your plate. You're like, it's not like the Holocaust with the Jews, you know? And even PETA will use very, very explicit World War II Jewish Holocaust imagery to sort of equate the suffering of animals. And it's interesting because it plays off as ultra ridiculous in that scene. They're just kind of like, look, this is stupid that you would think this is the same thing. But what the filmmaker is doing is from the very beginning making all these students seem very animalistic. Like they're always hunched over, they're sitting on the floor, or literally crawling like animals. And so
they're always filthy.
They're always covered in blood. They're just filthy. They're disgusting. I mean, to me, like this school looks super fun to go to.
I know.
I mean, it's definitely like the
no parents, no rules. Teachers don't give a fuck.
Yeah. Could you imagine like that shit in fucking UC Berkeley right now? Like you have like the incoming freshman class that gets covered with blood.
Yeah, it's just Lord of the Flies,
Yeah.
but animal saving.
Yeah, it's like get the fuck out of France with your safe spaces, you fucking nerds. But yeah, like so there is this kind of like conversation about, okay, well it's different, but then you realize they're not talking about the rights of the animal at one point. You realize that they're actually talking about that it would be gross to fuck a monkey, and that's why it's different.
Right.
Like that's kind of where they're left at.
But what I think is great about that conversation also is that she is setting up an equation between eating animals and eating humans. Mm-hmm. And then that's exactly, once she crosses one, she immediately crosses the other.
Yeah.
You know, she maybe partly tastes a meatball, and then she eats part of a sheep's testicle or whatever it was.
Oh,
and
rabbit
then
kidney.
That's it.
Yeah.
And then the next thing, she's eating her sister's finger. So for her, it actually is the same.
Well, in between that, though, there's that really great scene where the roommate takes her to go eat shawarma up the road. And like everything about that scene is super weird and awkward. But the previous scene we were just talking about, where they're talking about, it starts off like whether or not you can still get AIDS from a monkey.
Right.
Because that's the urban legend of like, where did this come from? Somebody fucked a monkey.
Right.
And that goes back to like a Sam Kinison joke. Like that's one of his earliest jokes. Like, because somebody fucked a monkey, I have to wear a fucking rubber. Like that was this joke in the early 80s. And it sort of revived a little bit in this scene. You're like, whoa, weird. I haven't even thought about that in a long time.
Right.
And then the one gay character rightly sort of is like, why are we even having this conversation? You know, like, are you worried about me fucking a monkey or having AIDS? And it just adds this discomfort to an already discomfort filled scene. It's just so good. But then talk about like ramping up the discomfort. They're eating meat at this truck stop. So it's like truck stop meat. So it's probably the French equivalent of going to fucking Time Saver and getting a hot dog.
Yeah.
You know, it's probably like the grossest thing that you could possibly be eating. And then he makes this offhanded conversation about truckers. It's not even that bad. And this trucker runs over and like grabs him by the ear and is like rubbing him and tells him this whole crazy story while she's nonstop chowing down. So there's always, whenever she's having pleasure, there's always something really awful going on around the same time.
Yeah.
Something else I thought the director did really well is all the crowd scenes, I think, are just great. Like when she's like kind of stumble wandering through parties and stuff. The
long takes. Yeah.
Yeah, these really long party takes. I think she really just nails the disorientation and like sort of like dark magic of a club, or especially like an underground club.
Yeah, clubs are almost always shot really poorly in films. Mm-hmm. It's one of my many pet peeves is whenever there's a party in a movie, you're like, those people are not listening to this music. Mm-hmm. But the parties in Raw really feel like these people are fucking going off. Like these people are, it really does feel like I'm watching a room full of people getting wrecked, and it feels really abandoned. And I feel like that sinks us deeper into the sort of no parents, no rules, Lord of the Flies world that we're immersed in, which, again, going back to part of our conversation about it, is what happens when there are no parents, there are no parental figures, what happens when it's just the kids, what are the rules, and these virtually consequence-free parties happen is an embodiment of that.
Yeah, and the whole idea of like the veterans like being in charge of the noobs in this thing, like how they're like, oh, we will get you through this. Like, you're at school. Like, your professors should be getting you through this.
Exactly.
But in the film, there's only like 5 adult figures in the movie. There's the weirdo truck driver that rubs her ear. There's the two parents, the mother and the father. And then there's the nurse and the professor.
That fucking professor.
And they're both weird as shit.
Yeah.
Like the nurse is super odd. Like she's got like a weird neck tattoo. Again, like this is just all about the casting of this movie is just so great. Yeah. Oh, there's one other adult I'm forgetting, but I'll add him here. So 6 adults. So there's the nurse. So when she goes in and originally has her rash all over her body, like her nurse just tells her this super non sequitur story about how a fat woman came in, and because she was able to find her veins and draw her blood, she was upset and being fat was not a thing. And it's just a weird conversation. And then the actress is like smoking in the office with her, which like, I mean, that went away here with the Mad Men era, you know, so maybe you can still smoke in a doctor's office in France. I don't know. Then there is the professor who's like some sort of weird Harry Potter character who's like totally fucking with her the whole time.
Yep.
Like he's like, oh, you know, at the very beginning, he has this kind of twinkle in his eye when she turns in her paper and he's like, oh, look, an error already. But then later on, he like catches her cheating or something like that. And he like reads her the riot act about how she's too gifted to be there and she doesn't deserve any pity, but her friend who's kind of stupid deserves pity. And her total, and this, I mean, this must be just fucking socialism at work, but it's like, oh, you're so good that you're going to drive away other like working class doctors. It doesn't make any sense, you know? And then there is the weird old man that's in the doctor's office with the dentures.
Yes.
Such a strange scene.
More body horror.
Yeah, there's all this awkward body horror. And even like every single actor has something off about them. There's the scene where she is in the bathroom and she's just thrown up all the hair, and then she comes to the sink and there's the kind of weird Asian girl that walks up and she's like, oh, it's easier to vomit if you put 2 fingers down your throat. Like, okay, here's a little bit of like,
great,
you know, like showing her the ropes of bulimia. But then she has the most awkward smile at herself in the mirror.
Like just faking it.
Yeah, it's just great. Like every single scene in this movie has a weird actor.
Going back to the denture dude, it's funny thinking about this movie in terms of how the gaze functions, because I mean, it's cinema, it's built in horror cinema, it often takes on specific meanings, who's watching who and why. It tends to be more predatory in horror films. And in this movie, as far as I can think, he is the one moment when the gaze is masculine, because what I found in this movie is that the way the gaze is used is it's almost only Justine. And there are 2 shots in particular, and she stares right into the lens when she fucks her roommate and bites her arm, and she just stares just fucking confronts you.
She just looks like the girl from Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
Like there's just so much, like her face is just covered in gore.
Yeah. And then the other time is one of the party scenes where she's sitting kind of at the far end, and she's she's just got the hunger in her eyes, and she stares into the camera. But there's also when she's not staring at the camera, like when she's watching her roommate or the boys play ball, when she's watching the guys play basketball, you know, she's just like hungering for these bodies. And so the camera, when it is standing in for some sort of gaze, it's actually hers. Except for when that old man is fucking with her, because it goes from like, oh, he's just smiling, he's just this nice innocent man, and it seems to sort of be like, it goes from that to like, oh, he's fucking with her, that's weird. But as soon as he starts to laugh, it's like, oh, this is actually a little sinister. This isn't just like, oh, he's old and bored and a little crazy and whatever.
Yeah.
It's actually a little dark.
And it's in the neighborhood of the scene in Black Swan where the dude's just jerking off on the train and he's looking at her.
Right.
But this is even worse, I think. There's just something even more malicious about his whole thing. But then again, you're also like, okay, this is just a jokey old man. Like, I can't even remember the last time I've seen fucking dentures. You know, is that even a thing that happens anymore? Like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But the other scene, though, the one you mentioned where she's just kind of staring forward at the camera and the camera's moving through this crowd.
Yeah.
So much great shit going on with the crowd. Like you were saying, like, you know, you never get the crowd scene right. There is a couple and this woman is licking this guy's eyeball.
Yes.
In the foreground.
That's one of my favorite things I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not fake. I mean, this dude's eye is getting licked.
Oh, dude, total CGI.
CGI. Huh? But to me, that was the pleasure of watching this film in French and without subtitles. Is it allowed me to kind of like stop watching the subtitles and start seeing a lot of the choices that are made with the camera. And the camera like slinks around. It has like this like really like sleazy panther low movement. Like you get the like I could almost imagine like the camera guy being like crouched down really low to follow these characters that are often hunched and crouched.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Moving from camera to music, the music in this movie was so solid. And again, I think when they're partying, it's totally believably club music instead of maybe, you know, sometimes you watch a party scene in a movie and it's like, this is not the music that would be playing at this party, whether it's era non-specific or it's like too shitty for everybody to be so excited. It's fully like aggressive techno. That hip hop track that she listens to when she's looking at herself in the mirror is genius. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I can only imagine
that like gothic, violent.
I mean, it's like some French Insane Clown Posse shit.
It is.
I mean, it really like such lines as "fuck 69, give me 666."
Yeah.
I mean, it's so weird. And the other line, like, I fuck the dead over and over again. And it's just some hardcore, like MIA sounding French woman just rapping. And I was about to look the track up, but I don't want to know anything else. I like to think that there's just some really ultra shitty French deathcore hip hop group that wears like just bad found crisscross stuff with like misfit skulls sewn on it. Just total mixed up nonsense.
We should look them up.
Yeah, we should probably
I want to know.
Yeah. Some of the soundtrack though has this weird like what I would describe as vampire rock.
Well, a lot of it is very Michael Nyman-ish, which again comes back to what I was saying about Peter Greenaway, because Michael Nyman did the soundtrack for A Zed and Two Knots and has done most of Greenaway's films, but it's that sort of like, it's very like if Philip Glass was more classicist and used more harpsichord or something like that.
Yeah, and then ran it through his shitty Line 6 distortion amp. But like in a good way. Like, do you remember this really terrible goth band, Nosferatu? Did you ever hear that band?
I probably have some on my iTunes right now.
Oh my God. First of all, they're terrible.
Second, no argument here.
Yeah. But, you know, they had that sort of like weird, like non-hard rock distorted guitar with like just these like arpeggiated runs and then like a harpsichord banging away in the background.
It was not a great moment for gothic music.
No, but in this film, it's great. Like those sort of like weird harpsichordy things. It gives the movie, sometimes you're like, wait a minute, am I watching a vampire movie?
Right.
Even though it's explicitly not.
Totally.
It's just, there's so many things that the director has done to complicate everything. Like everything in this is complicated.
Yeah. You know, I'm curious. Let's go back to talking about Extremity as an idea. And I have a question for you. If there is for you like I mean, I know a lot of people who don't who are friends of mine who listen to podcasts, who don't listen to this one because they just don't watch horror movies. Like they just can't do it.
They should definitely not listen to this show then.
There's also a lot of curse words.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have a boundary somewhere that they won't cross with what they are willing to take in. And so I'm curious if you have a personal boundary and it's a separate question, if you think there should be a boundary in general for art making and cinema.
Well, so for me personally, I think, intellectually, I'm like, just no fucking boundaries, right? Like there's,
So no rules. No parents, no rules.
No parents, no rules. But I would say I would be dishonest if I didn't say that like animal stuff didn't bother me a little bit. Like to me, the most horrifying and terrifying movie that has ever been made is Earthlings, which is...
I've never seen it.
It's an animal rights movie. And it is the movie that if you were to say like, is there 90 minutes that'll turn people vegan? It's this movie. I mean, it's the most brutal collection of animal torture movies. And honestly, it's everything that happens before your food gets to your plate.
Right.
So it's not the most extreme. It's just an extreme view at what's normal. And
Unless you're French, then you're like, who's hungry?
yeah. I mean, to me,
Hot
like,
tub.
I feel like everybody who eats meat should see Earthlings, because if you can afterwards, you're like, burger, great, then fine. But if you're like, oh my God, I'm so horrified, I can't fucking deal with this, it's the fucking worst thing I've ever seen, then you don't deserve to eat meat, in my opinion. Like, if you can't see it, like I personally have seen thousands of animals die, and just from working around like slaughterhouses and stuff like that, and like I'm less comfortable with it than I used to be, like eating it, but not like, but I simply like just don't like eating. I never liked chicken, and that's the most number of animals I've seen. I went to like a chicken slaughterhouse one day and just watched this machine of death execute at least 1,000 birds in front of me, like within a few minutes. I mean, it's pretty crazy to think of the scale. And the place I went is a full-on super hippie farm with like tons of rules and oversight and organic certifications and like open door policy and transparent practices. The vast majority of food is not like that.
No.
So I would say probably animal stuff. Like, I don't like in American Psycho, I don't like when Patrick Bateman stomps the dog to death. But at the same time, I think that makes that character better. You're like, fuck, this is the type of dude that'll stomp some homeless guy's dog to death.
Right.
Have
you seen Cannibal Holocaust?
Yes.
There's animal death in that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad. And I think for me, it's just because, I just wouldn't want to hurt an animal like that, I guess. I don't know. Like, I can't think of many scenes where I would want to beat a dog to death, but I can often think about reasons why I would want to beat a person to death. So I don't know. Maybe that's just a bad outlook on life. What about you? Like,
well, I feel like there are no shoulds, but I feel like words have consequences, actions have consequences, and I feel like sometimes people protect art from the consequences of its words and meaning. And I know that art is open to interpretation, but at the same time, when there's this sort of attitude that art can't hurt you, or art is almost like a protected class, that sort of implies that art doesn't have a genuine effect in the world. It sort of undermines the transformative potential of, let's just say in the circumstance, cinema, right? If you act like cinema has the same consequences on the universe as like a baby's gurgles, then, well, what the fuck is it for? I'm really hard pressed to think of any examples where I believe censorship is warranted in the history of filmmaking, other than something like snuff films, something like that, where it's not about film, it's about someone's rights. I know that there's some sort of gray area where like things like human decency and things like that do come into play, but it's not about censorship. As far as my own feelings, I will say, and we're talking about French Extremity, I saw the film Martyrs some time ago, and it actually, despite the fact that for a long, long time now, I mostly watch horror movies, Martyrs got me to stop watching horror movies for about 6 months. It like really fucked me up, and I was really depressed afterwards. Like, I don't know that any film has affected me as much as that movie did. And it sort of like crossed a line that I didn't know I had. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading that book, reading Lolita and Tehran right now, and there's an argument where at one point they put the book The Great Gatsby on trial in the classroom, and it's right before the Iranian Revolution happens and all the fucking bad dudes take over, and they have this argument in it where it's about like, okay, what is the purpose of fiction? And so one of the arguments is that, okay, the example of Gatsby is corrupting to people. And so if people are like, well, but he's also a cautionary tale about what it means when you think that money and a 17-year-old's idea of what a billionaire should do becomes the thing that you do. And it's very similar to what you were just saying in that like art either does or does not do things for real. And
Right.
if it does do things for real, then you're in the neighborhood of what should it be doing. And it's kind of like the simple one is like, oh, it's just art, it's just horror, it's just murder, whatever, who cares?
Right.
And it's really easy to say floodgates open when that's your perspective. When you actually, it's easier to say, oh, none of this is important, so everything should be allowed. And that's actually kind of like a really cynical sort of like commodity view of artwork. Like, well, if people want to pay to see this dude throw peanuts at a kid covered in shit, so what? You know, like this sort of like Barker, like carnival sort of look at it. Mm-hmm. But so, you know, in a weird way, like the argument that what should art be doing, it sort of for a brief second made me a little sympathetic to the Ayatollah, where like from his perspective, he's like, well, I want only art that's going to make people be better at being Muslims in this society. So you're like, okay, well, what should it be doing? I'm like, well, fuck that agenda, right? That's my next thought. It's like, that sounds terrible, actually. And then, like, do you think that, so this is a roundabout way of me asking you this question is, do you think the artist owes anything to society broader, or do they just owe their own vision and they have to come up with whatever that is?
I don't think anybody owes anybody anything as an artist any more than anybody owes anything to others as a citizen. Mm-hmm. Don't be an asshole. I think that applies to being a neighbor and to being an artist.
Right.
But sometimes you gotta, I don't know, I'm drawing a bad comparison, but like, you know, sometimes you're a bad neighbor because you had a party till 4 a.m. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you gotta go like, hey, sorry everybody, once a year I have a party till 4 a.m. Fuck you, sorry. Like, I'm just gonna be selfish, but I'm not gonna do it much. And I feel like being an artist is in a certain way like that. Like, sometimes I just gotta do my thing, and I kind of have to say, fuck you, mm-hmm. because it's more important for me to do my thing than for me to be concerned with what your concerns are. Yeah. I think that's not much of an argument. It's kind of a weak way of saying it, but I don't think artists owe people anything, because I don't think artists are special or seers or there should be an agenda. There's no shoulds. It's just art. It's just people doing shit.
Yeah. It's interesting.
What about you?
Well, I mean, it makes me think about how another conversation we had when we were talking about how filmmakers in horror, for a long time, the creature or the villain is sort of like the hero. And like, so what does that mean? Like, right. Who are you left to root for? And is it important to even have someone to root for? And you see a lot of the conversation around Patrick Bateman's character in American Psycho was, okay, you have a character that checks a lot of the successful boxes. So attractive, handsome, powerful, rich, blah, 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 and also a murderer. And Patrick Bateman at the time, or not Patrick Bateman, but Bret Easton Ellis at the time was essentially like, look, obviously this is a terrible character, but time passes a little bit and everybody is like, not everybody, but there's a certain class of person who's like, Gordon Gekko's the fucking man. And it's just a hop and a skip to Patrick Bateman. Fuck yeah, on a bad night, I'd be totally, there's this kind of,
wow, yeah,
this vilification happening, but also this like honorification. Like the people sort of like the bad guy a little bit. And so
I think you're sort of, sorry to interrupt
yeah.
your flow, but I think that's partly what we're seeing in the current administration is a bit of that.
Well, yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go.
Sorry.
No, I mean, yeah, totally. But like, imagine if somebody made a character right now that was sort of like an updated Patrick Bateman character that was like a MAGA hat wearing dude, but you made the character really cool. That's for sure going to be somebody's Halloween costume a little bit. And to me, I've always felt like this is odd, into the territory of woo and metaphysics, but when you dress up as something, you're sort of empowering this avatar or this idea a little bit. So to me, whenever you look around and you see like a hot Halloween costume, that's sort of like and not sexy, I just mean popular, or although hot
sexy
too.
MAGA hat.
Like I feel like when you look at Halloween every year, you get a baseline look at what people really want to be, sure. and all that stuff basically comes from Halloween. And at least since last year, it appears that people want to be a hot clown's sidekick, which is Harley Quinn. You know, like that's basically. And I guarantee there's going to be like a bazillion characters from It this Halloween, whether it be Pennywise or like Georgie wearing the raincoat or whatever.
Right.
But then you have a movie like Raw where you just simply have a protagonist and like the character is more or less animalistic, and the director is sort of sidestepping what I think is sort of an American idea, which is that where's the moral code in this? And then I think it's because there is literally moral codes for entertainment at different points. Like I'm reading, like back to the EC Comics that I'm reading right now, it maintains a lot of the elements from the original publication. And so in each issue, there's a full page spread about the comics code and how it's a symbol of morality and decency, and not just that, but also quality. So there was this sort of idea that comes out of the 50s and the 60s that if a fiction is absent a moral message, it's absent quality. And that doesn't seem to be something that the French picked up on at all.
Well, it's funny because that, you know, we are so against, in our freedom-loving country, we're so against ideas of socialist realism.
I know I am.
I think it's great. But it's funny. I didn't know about those codes, but it sounds like that's exactly the same thing. It's a bunch of people assenting to upholding a very specific morality. That's not. I'm assuming you're describing that something wasn't imposed like the MPAA or something like that, right?
Oh, it was. I mean, it was explicitly imposed. Like you. I mean, there were
imposed by the
state.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
But
fuck,
it was also one of those like state impositions that was sort of like, we'll regulate ourselves and we'll be the government, and you know, like how that sort of happens. Like, so you have your first wave of self-serving do-gooders that like go to like self-regulate, and they just aggressively do it, and they're like, well, we're just like you guys and we set the rules and you guys should want to follow the rules too. Like that. Yeah. That seems. I mean, it seems very like a real American way of like rating cinema. But I mean, but not just that though, because I mean, a real orthodox way might be another way of saying it. Because in communist countries, there was this whole idea of art makes a good socialist. So like you would teach people how to be a good worker with your art. Have you seen Comrade Detective? Do you know what that is?
No.
Man, it's fucking hilarious. I mean, it's only for small doses, but Channing Tatum and Joseph Gordon-Levitt have this. There's this show on Amazon, and the shtick is it was a canceled 1980s era buddy cop show that took place in the Eastern Bloc of Soviet Russia, and everything in it is designed to show the evil of America and the glory of the Soviet state. And so like people are like crowded around a television watching people play chess. And there's these kids running around the street like just doing Bolshevik shit, like just doing like ballet and stuff. But it's dubbed over. So it's a new show, right? But the shtick is it's old, but they found it and they redubbed it. So you have Channing Tatum as like the voice of one of the detectives. I mean, it's just super absurd. But you get in it, it's like, I guess all states have tried to put their rules and ideas into fiction. I mean, even back to Roman times. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you know what I say? No parents, no rules.
Yeah, totally.
For the fifth time
it's
this
better,
episode.
It's better that way.
What else do we have?
So, I mean, there's so many great... I have, like, the most unhelpful notes because, like, for instance, this one, fucking bite fight. This is amazing. And then I love that they're holding the girls back like pit bulls. World Wrestling Federation shit right there. Like that's like one of my notes for this. Like so I had these visceral isn't the right word, but I was just wowed by these scenes. They're just so weird and original, and I don't want to say shocking as much as awkward. They're like aggressively awkward every single scene. But that scene where they're biting each other, and just sort of gripping in each other's arm after the one older sister has bitten her cheek off, it's just great. And then they're holding them like fighting dogs.
Yeah.
At the end, like there's so much there.
Yeah, there have been a few instances that I can think of in zombie movies where like zombies are used as entertainment for their, and they definitely did that in The Walking Dead, where it was sort of like hybrid human zombie entertainment, gladiator fighting style. But again, these are ostensibly humans who can control their craving for flesh. One thing that it does cross, though, is there is a difference between a cannibal, someone who eats humans or enjoys. I guess there's 3 levels, right? There's willing to eat a human, enjoying eating human, and this is like cannot control one's appetite from consuming human flesh. Like, let's be honest, I have never torn into a piece of food of any sort when I was any level of hungry, like these 2 characters dig into humans, right? So there's something more than just, I'm born with a taste for human flesh.
Yeah. It's something I kept trying to figure out was like, do they gain anything? Like, do they have any like cannibal powers?
I think they just get these rashes, but it seems to be able to be cleared up with that ointment.
Yeah, the rash thing I didn't quite get, where it's like, so she... I mean, when you think about like she did that short film before where the girl like sloughs her skin off and she's like shedding her old skin. That's kind of what's going on in this film. Like she's shedding her old skin because it peels off in huge chunks. And so
but the sister has the same ointment in her bathroom.
Right. And so it's like,
it's a family. It's either a cannibal thing or it's a family thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's another scene that's just so subtle. She just notices the same thing. And you're not... What I love about this movie, or maybe it's just like non-American movie.
It's non-American.
And I don't want... And I'm definitely not in the business of shitting on America stuff. But it's just not explained. You're not even... it's not even clear whose house they're in.
Right.
They're just brushing their teeth. And there's no exposition of like, thanks for coming over tonight. And look, oh, this is my bathroom. What a mess. Like, where you're not... No one's holding your hand as to whose bathroom it is and what that ointment is. And
in a Hollywood film, she would have picked up the ointment and said, "What the?" out loud or something.
Yeah. I mean, even like a pretty well-regarded movie like Get Out has that. Like in the very beginning when Lakeith Stanfield is walking through the neighborhood, he's like, "Oh, I'm in this white neighborhood. Oh man," and you're like, it's clear what's going on. Like you're in a fucking perfectly hedge road, like no one out at night, Volvos up and down the street neighborhood. Like anyone who's been in America would know what sort of neighborhood it is. Like you don't need to say that. And it's like even like our champions, like Jordan Peele still resort to it. And I just wonder if cinema in general would just be improved if they just knocked that shit out. I think so.
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, who doesn't do it very much is the dude that directed Blue Ruin and Green Room.
Exactly.
Yeah. It just
happens.
It just happens, or it's explained a little bit in the scenes. Like, oh shit, that's a Nazi bumper sticker.
Right.
Oh shit, that's a hammer skin tattoo. Like it's kind of done with the scene.
Yeah. Someone says boots and braces, and either you know what that is or you don't.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be explained.
And then the story is just so strong that you don't have to know all that. Like I just reread Stephen King's On Writing, and he has a chapter where he talks about research. And this is something I'm super guilty of because I just love little factoids and shit, is you read all about this stuff and you want to cram it really forward in whatever you're working on. And honestly, it just doesn't need to be forward no matter what. Like say you're writing a story about fucking black metal bands or whatever. You don't need to explain any of that shit.
Right.
At all. You can just describe the face paint, some other elements, and just, really fast drum beats. You don't need to be, oh, he played double time blast beats. Like it's just not,
exactly.
It's just not a thing that's necessary.
Well, that's what's funny about this film in particular, and a lot of New French Extremity, honestly, is that it has this counterbalance between the fact that it is very extreme, aggressive, overt. It overpowers the audience, but also on another level, understated, subtle, leaves you to your own conclusions, right? It's sort of like heavy-handed in a way that American cinema rarely is, but also understated in a way that American cinema rarely is.
Yeah. Like something else that I think in American cinema is there's a lot of like questions. If you go to like a Reddit forum on this, there's like, well, what the fuck? Was she a vampire or what? You're like, why does she even have to be an existing canonical monster? Like just that itself is pretty silly. And I've been thinking a lot about it, how I certainly enjoy a little bit of this stuff, but the idea of it's like X but Y, and things like it's a vampire, but they're in Detroit and they just lay around, that sort of thing. Like you're still dealing with a vampire. You're still playing with this sort of tired as fuck trope. And at a certain point, it's like, okay, where is the bravery to create a new non-canonical type of monster?
Well, again, vampires are maybe the most guilty. No, maybe zombie cinema is, but where, okay, that's a zombie. Someone's got to explain what the parameters of this zombie are. Vampires. Okay, at some point we got to know, how do you destroy it? Does it sleep in a coffin? Now that I know it's a vampire, what are the rules? And when you step outside of that, no rules, are left with a much more interesting text. And you get to read that text rather than sort of check boxes off, your horror cinema list of check boxes. Like, what is it doing that I'm familiar with and that I already know? It just opens wide to more interpretation and more possibilities oftentimes.
Yeah, there's almost like a search engine optimization need to like include a monster or a thing that you're familiar with. I mean, for instance, Lovecraft Country, which I loved. You don't necessarily, you call the thing Lovecraft Country on the fucking cover, and it's sort of there's conversations about H.P. Lovecraft in it. So you've sort of ported your entire book into that mythos. And that's sort of what's interesting about this mythos is like, okay, how would black people deal with this? And that's interesting. But what about something even weirder, where it's like you have black characters and they're dealing with something that no one's ever even seen before? Is that just unsellable? Right. Think about like Meg, who was just on our show, Meg Illison. Her book is fucking great. Like, it was one of my favorite books of the year. It's still kind of a disease happens, and then people, like the like a disease kicks off an apocalypse. Like, there's a bunch of those books, and I think even she would say that she's in that genre.
Right.
But then again, how do you wipe out the whole planet? Like, do you just come up with some new corny trope that you have to explain, and then that becomes the whole thing? It's like if you were to introduce something new and then not explain it, you get into that sort of dissatisfaction that rears its head when you step off of the trope.
I think that is most present, or at least the way we can see it most right now, is in porn. John Ronson, his new, it's not a book, it's only an audiobook available on Audible, is about what's happened to the porn industry as a result of Pornhub. And one of the subjects of this audiobook is that porn films used to be called like, The Night Nurse, or I don't know, whatever. It used to be called anything, but now it's like Drunken Teen Stepdaughter Cheerleader Orgy.
Yeah.
Because the title has to be optimized, and Pornhub tracks who searches for what and what the most common searches are and how they evolve and how different cultures use searches. And then the creators of porn content have to react and then not just name it something that is search engine optimized, but also create content that is ready for those search engine optimizations. And genres are like that. You step outside of genre and you feel the wrath of either fewer clicks or, let's say like power metal, super conservative. You step out of line just this much and everybody freaks the fuck out.
Yeah. Well, I do it in my day job. My day-to-day life is I'm a copywriter, right? So and before I was working in food, and this is one of the things I found my whole relationship to like working in tech now is kind of weird, because in some ways you're like, man, these are the smartest, nicest people I've been around in a really long time. But at the same time, like everything I'm writing has to go through this sort of algorithm concern, like where it's like, okay, this is search engine optimization. So I want to name an article something like, like whatever, some sort of funny title that would catch your eye. Like there would be a good book title or an album title. And it can't be that. It has to be, easy, fast digital asset management for project managers. Like those words have to be in there.
Yeah.
And so you're left with like the crowd's creativity. It does create a little bit of room for creativity, because if you can do something clever in that format, it's sort of high speed. But I also wonder what titles are being suppressed. That, like the longer that becomes the thing to do, like are people not going to make cool stuff that sort of like breaks out? Something I'm concerned about with algorithms is how films are rated. I think you were talking about this the other day, like having concern over like Rotten Tomatoes or whatever. Is like a lot of these movies that we love didn't make it at the box office, and now not only are they not going to make it at the box office because nobody goes to see fucking movies, but they're not going to make it in secondary markets because you're like, oh, that has 20%. I'll never watch that. I mean, imagine what like Cemetery Man would have gotten when it came out now in Rotten. It would have been like a 40% movie, but it's a cool, weird indie movie. And I wonder if like long term, only these quirky auteur horror movies are going to make it. And there's like a whole class of horror films that aren't going to advance forward that could have been classics.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that this is another version of the struggle of how do you work inside versus outside the system. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just that we're talking about a different system. We're not talking about film studios necessarily. We're talking about algorithms, but it's a similar conversation, right? Of like, okay, here's the state of things. Here's the ways in which it quashes creativity. Here's the ways in which it opens up creativity. Mm-hmm. What are the possibilities? And, to my mind, something like Raw, which is a film that she doesn't think of it as a horror movie. It feels like one to me, but that's immaterial. The fact is, and is it a cannibal film? Well, that's the subject matter, but what is that? Mm-hmm. What does that even mean? That's not really, cannibal film isn't even a genre, really. There are films that have cannibals, but it's not like vampire cinema, which there are legions of books about, for example. It's not a thing that people aspire, it's not like there is a legacy of cannibal fiction the way there is that same thing for other monsters and horrors. This film in particular is so on the outside of so many traditions, and that's the very thing that makes it interesting and makes it very worth watching, because you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know where it's going.
Yeah. And what's cool about this movie is you can't know where it's going. Or maybe it is so common, these beats in French cinema, that like for instance, I play this game with my wife when we watch American Horror Story, which we haven't done for several seasons, but we started watching this new all-time terrible season of American Horror Story. The credits go up and I see how one character looks at another character. I'm like, this, and this are going to happen in this episode. And I'm always right. And it's not because I'm super smart. It's just because American Horror Story is so paint by numbers that you can pick up those beats. And I wonder if in France, they're like, of course they're going to eat the finger, and they're going to blame it on the dog, and the dog's going to get killed, and it's going to be really sad. I wonder if, like with Japanese horror, right? Like I just don't know anything about it. So I don't know. Wet hair is gross to all Japanese people, apparently, according to what I've read. Is that real? I don't know.
Well, speaking of the where are things going, thought about Raw as being a pilot for a TV show. Mm-hmm. And not to think of this as only TV or as good as TV or anything like that, but rather the way it ends, what's so interesting about its conclusion is that it's so pregnant with possibilities, right? Mm-hmm. It's this reveal It's kind of a twist, not really, but kind of. But you can totally see that, like, oh, now what? This has just begun. Justine's journey, this is just her discovery of who she is. She still has her whole life ahead of her, and it's going to be fucking chaos from here on, probably.
Yeah.
Right? When you see Dad's scars on his chest, each of those scars has a story, and that's what Justine's life sort of has ahead of her. Anyway, that's sort of how I found that it was a great ending. It's because it's just like, oh my God, what next? You know?
Yeah, there's a scene or there's a bit of dialogue that seems unimportant the first time you watch it, and there's a lot of dialogue like this, but where the father says, "Don't have two daughters," to his daughter, and you're like, "Oh, it's just so hard to have two girls." And in reality, it's like this shit is passed through the bloodline to women, and if you have two daughters, you're gonna have to deal with fucking flesh-eating women around you your whole life, and it's kind of a drag because you get chewed on.
I kind of like that the two daughters, the way they function is that it seems like Alexia, when Justine shows up, maybe had it under control. I mean, she was clearly going out and murdering people to eat them out of their cars, but it's not like you don't get the impression everybody at schools knows she's a cannibal. And then Justine shows up and she comes into her cannibalness as a result of Alexia forcing her to eat flesh and not ratting her out for eating a finger and etc. Right? But then it seems that Justine being there triggers Alexia to get even worse and more reckless. Alexia outs Justine with the video, but at the same time, Alexia gets completely reckless in a way that she clearly has not been for the last year or several years at school, right? It's like them being together is this folie à deux, or it's this interesting circumstance where it's not just like, oh, there's a cannibal and it's secret, and then her younger sister's a cannibal too. It's like they trigger something in each other that by being together, they are more out of control, both of them.
It's like Thelma and Louise.
Kind of like that.
Yeah, yeah. And there is like kind of like the French girls going off to get like that movie Baiser Moi is kind of like that. And yeah, I guess you just can't let these sisters get together. It's weird too though, like you don't often see, I mean, I guess you see it in like Ginger, like, I mean, probably the closest American film, I assume it's American and could be Canadian, I guess, but I think you were right earlier when you were talking about like Ginger Snaps.
Canadian.
Oh, is it Canadian?
Get it right.
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I thought. I thought like this movie.
It's strangely understated.
Nothing blows up, and they're not quite werewolves. So Canadian. It's like even Pontypool. You know, like also not an American movie. You know, just a weirdo film that comes. I mean, Jesus, maybe America doesn't have it together for horror. Recently,
there's really isn't much good American horror cinema
in the last 10 years. I mean, I would be really, in the last 10 years, what would you put that was American?
The Witch.
The Witch, really?
I don't know what would finish your sentence. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, what would you put in the same category of quality of this or
Neon Demon, The Witch, It Follows.
But isn't it,
like every film we've covered that's American.
Right, but Neon Demon is, I'll give you The Witch, right? But Neon Demon, that guy's not American.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I mean. There's always some non-American kind of guy. And
you
then
can smell it.
And the dude who did The Witch, that's a Brooklyn hipster. I mean, that's barely American. Like, you know, I mean, he's like self-identifies that way. You know, that's what he calls himself. It's not me just digging on him. You know, and then I think of all those
You're
films.
so from the South right now. Like, he's from Brooklyn. He's not even a real American.
You know what I mean, though? Like, yeah, I mean, first of all, yes.
No, I know what you mean, Chad.
Yeah. First of all, north of the Mason-Dixon line, not actually America. Everyone knows that. Especially from Brooklyn, where kombucha comes from. Like 100% of the time when you run into somebody in New Orleans who's terrible, you're like, "Where are you from?" "Oh, I just came here from New York." Like 100% of the time, like I could tell by your cutoff overalls and your jaunty hat, sir.
Oh, dear God.
Yeah, I'm just kidding about all this stuff. But I mean, like, yeah, like so The Witch 1, which is essentially like trying to be a French art house film, you know.
Oh, I totally disagree. There's so many good horror movies.
But I mean, on that level.
On that level, okay. No,
I mean, what I mean, like.
Well, okay. If I can interrupt,
Yeah.
few movies are like this is a really special movie. So saying like, well, how many American films or American horror films in the last 10 years are this good? Well, not many, because not much is. Period.
I mean, and then again, like, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think our common listeners might be a little surprised at me putting America second. I mean. Don't get it twisted. I would watch Red Dawn over Raw 19 out of 20 times. Like if it was like I was flipping through channels and it was like a choice between Wolverines and this, you know, I'm definitely going to watch some Russians get killed. But I don't know. I think part of it is like horror requires novelness a little bit to be extra freaky and fun. Like we were talking about Stranger Things, that there's just, or not Stranger, It, which may as well be Stranger Things. The new It, there's some interesting new shots, new effects, I guess, to go along with these scares. They'll be in every movie, just like Bullet Time was in every movie following it. You know, we're going to get that same very center-focused creature still while the rest of the screen goes crazy.
Yeah.
That's going to be a thing for sure. But, I mean, I don't know. Is that more successful or less successful as horror? I mean, I don't know. Like, I found myself going, more in It than in Raw. So maybe It is a more successful movie. I mean, I can't think of a more Hollywood movie than It.
Truly.
I mean, it is like 100% hardcore Hollywood film.
Yeah.
But great, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. If you were going to eat a famous person, who would it be?
Ooh.
Like if you were going to one time cannibal out, and I don't even mean like, oh, I just bite them on the neck and drink their blood like a sexy vampire. I mean like raw down, chewing off the leg.
Okay, but in this circumstance, what am I getting out of it? Is
nothing. You're satiating your abysmal hunger that cannot be satiated.
So if I'm like on my wall, I have like photos of like every Hollywood celebrity, and I'm like, which one makes me hungry?
Doesn't have to be Hollywood. It could be a musician, or if you were just to imagine yourself eating someone famous, out of desire or spite, it's up to you.
Matt Damon?
Awesome. Why Matt Damon?
I don't know.
Just you like think he looks tasty?
Maybe.
Yeah. I'm 100% going to eat Kanye West.
Because you want to like consume his power.
He'd just be the most interesting person to eat, I think. I think that like...
I mean, like, is this person alive while you're eating them so you get to experience what they do while... Like what would Kanye West be like if someone was eating him and you get to witness that firsthand?
I mean, I don't think that... I think it's more of a private moment than that. You know, I think it's about you and Kanye West, not about the rest of the world.
No, that's what I mean. Like, there's a difference between, like, there's a dead body in front of you and you're going to eat it, but to experience the very singular... God, this... I know this is a horror podcast, but this is very dark. But eating a dead body, like eating an animal that is still alive, but that animal is a person, and they're, even though, you know, if you're desperately trying to cling to life, everybody probably gets pretty similar. I don't think one's personality is very singularly expressed if you're trying to fight off being eaten alive.
Well, I think Kanye West has managed to turn his personal life into the Marcel Duchamp's urinal of personal lives. And I think just going out like that would be like a nice cherry on top of his life as art. You know? Maybe
I'll switch to Kim Kardashian and we can just like have dinner together.
A little surf and turf. I don't have anything else for Raw.
All right, maybe we should fade to black and roll the credits.
Yeah,
and we are going to see you all next time for our Halloween episode, Trick or Treat, movie from 2007. Excited to talk about it.
Yep, smell my feet. Give me something good to eat.
Thanks for listening.
All that stuff.
Bye. This is episode 27. We're covering Raw, the French film from 2016.
Did you hear that, or do you want to
Oh,
say
yeah.
some body horror going on?
It
over
really
here?
is.